Hello, and welcome to the State of 911 webinar series hosted by the National 911 Program. My name is Sherry, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This webinar series is designed to provide useful information for the 911 stakeholder community about federal and state participation in the planning, design, and implementation of Next Generation 911 or NG911 systems. It includes real experiences from leaders utilizing these processes throughout the country. Today's session will feature speakers from the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, region, and 4 mid-central states who will be sharing information on the Next Generation 911 Interstate Playbook, both Chapters 3 and 4. For closed captioning, please copy and paste the URL link in the chat window to an additional web browser. For more information on National 911 Program webinars, or to access archived recordings or learn more about National 911 programs, please visit 911.gov. Feedback or questions about the webinars can be sent to the National 911 team at mcp911.com. Please note that all participants' phone lines have been put in a listen-only mode, and this webinar is being recorded. To ask questions of our presenters, feel free to take one of two actions. Using GoToWebinar's question feature located on the right-hand side of your screen, enter your question at any time during the presentation and it will be entered into the queue. As a note, this feature is not visible while your screen is in the expanded page view. Or to ask your question live, use the raise hand feature to request that your phone line be unmuted, and we will call upon you to ask your question. Individuals registered for this webinar will receive access to both today's PowerPoint presentation and the webinar recording. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Lori Flaherty to introduce our speakers for the first chapter.
Thanks, Sherry. For those of you who are familiar with the Interstate Playbook, Chapters 1 and 2 are already available and posted on 911.gov. The folks that are talking today have been working at that for an awful long time. We're here today to talk a little bit about the newest chapters to the Interstate Playbook, Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. If you go on to the next slide, we're going to start with Chapter 3. And actually, this information applies to both Chapters 3 and Chapter 4. The reason the program undertook this activity was because we believe that these folks are experiencing things and learning things that not only would be helpful to you, but we believe a lot of the processes that they have used are reproducible. So Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 really are intended to provide information, to provide guidance, to help encourage collaboration. If you're starting to think about how your own 911 system will interconnect, will integrate with those around you, these playbooks are full of not only technical but non-technical advice and basically sharing experiences and lessons learned from those who are in the middle of that process themselves. They're not intended to be a cookie-cutter approach. We know that every 911 system is different. Certainly, we're not interested in recreating the wheel. They are absolutely not mandatory. But we've decided that since a lot of these processes are reproducible, it would really benefit you to learn from each other. So that's why we undertook the Interstate Playbook overall. Next slide, please. So Chapter 3, it really, as Sherry mentioned, is the experience of the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. And I'm going to let the folks who worked on Chapter 3 tell you a little bit about that group and what they have done together. All of the folks that are listed on this slide were part of the leadership of that group. Today, speaking on behalf of the entire group will be Steve McMurray, who is the 911 System Administrator in Fairfax County, Virginia, and Karima Holmes, who is the Director of the Office of Unified Communications in Washington, D.C. With that, I believe Karima and Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lori. And thanks to Lori and the team for giving us this space to talk about our progress and the things we have done here in the National Capital Region. I think it's very important for us as a region to share our progress, but I also think that it's very important for the industry to talk about our progress, the lack thereof, because I think what we're headed to is not only having our state, city, regional 911 systems coherent. I think across the nation, we are headed towards making sure our 911 ecosystem is cohesive. And as Lori said, whenever we don't have to reinvent the wheel, I think is always promising to do that. So today, myself and my colleague, Steve McMurray, are just going to talk about some of the experiences here in the National Capital Region and some of those just logistical technology paths we've taken with our infrastructure and management of this huge project. Chapter 3 of the Interstate Playbook just really encompasses our progress, our rah-rah moments, and our challenges. Next slide, please. So why did we do this? I'll talk a little bit about we have a 911 Directors Committee under the COG, which is our Metropolitan Washington's Council of Governments. That 911 Directors Committee was started shortly before I got here after a derecho storm event. And the 911 centers just really got together and found the need to develop this committee. It is about 20+ jurisdictions that's part of this committee, a dozen or so PSAPs that service those areas. And obviously, in a region so tightly knit, we have a lot of border calls. We have spillover from events, so not just calls for service may bounce from border to border, but we actually have events. For instance, the inauguration, it doesn't just affect DC. People get hotels in other places. Protests spills over to our jurisdictions. And so we really just thought about a need to make sure that we could help each other out and how we develop relationships with not only the 911 agencies, but also our partners, which I'll talk about a little later. Just a little bit about those border calls that we do receive. We ran a study a couple years ago and found that close to 10% of the calls in the region are usually going from they're hitting one 911 center and need to go to the other. DC alone, we tracked about 55,000 calls last year, or 2000, what year are we in? 2018, we had about 55,000 calls that either came into DC that needed to go to a sister city or vice versa. And so the need for that cohesiveness was obvious. And so as with every other 911 center across the region, we know we're only passing, when we're transferring calls, we're only passing over voice. The goals with Next Gen 911, among other things, is to pass video, picture, any-alley, or whatever else. And so, you know, you can't just go into something this important but first. You want to make sure that something this complicated and this important is really well versed and really well put together, and we have the buy-in to all the players. And so that's kind of how we got here. That is the why. I would say I came in a little shortly after the 911 Directors Group, and what we realized is, you know, as a 911 center, as a jurisdiction, we are not standalone, right? We're all interdependent rather, and dependent on each other. And so we want to make sure that not only are we serving each other, but we're serving those that reside in our jurisdictions, visit our jurisdictions. And then we also wanted to make sure that our approach was deliberate, it was coordinated, and it was effective. And so that's the why of why we're here. Next slide. So the big word here is definitely collaboration. This slide says collaboration creates energy, and that is very true. And the reason behind that is in this combination of this cohesiveness, we have a shared need. We all have shared responsibilities to our residents, our visitors, and our responders. And so you need the right players. And so this is a big part of what we've done in the region. We needed the right players, not only just expertise, right? We needed the right players as advocates. We needed champions. We needed leaders across the city government, not just in 911. And so this was different levels of representation that we saw the need for and we approached. So in our committee, we have representation from many levels. I mean, from the ops floor, the directors. We even have the 4 largest carriers play a role in our committee, and that's really key in a project that's huge. I think that what was also important was not only was that representation there, it got fed back into our 911 directors group, the larger group relationship. And I must drop some names here. From the leadership of Tony Rose, he's the chair of our committee. I'm the vice chair, and you have Dave Mahalan, who has a unique experience. I always talk about him because he has so many facets, right? You have the technical background, operational. He's running Arlington's 911 Center, so he definitely has the governance. But we had other individuals. You'll hear from Steve McMurray shortly. Teddy and my team, we had a lot of IT gurus that was able to add in here. Champions were really important. We have a Steve Souter who led when I first came in. He was the chair of this committee. And I would like to parenthetically add that he still keeps up with us. We want to make sure that we make him proud, so we must succeed. I also think about at the legislative level, the state of Maryland has a state senator, Shara Kagan, who is huge in this area, and things that she's doing should really be represented across the United States. She plays a key role in Maryland, but she's also kept regional goals in mind, and I think that's key. The state of Virginia, I have to give a shout out to Dorothy Spears Dean with the IT team. That was huge. You have movers and shakers that are part of our plight. I was even talking to the team earlier, and we talked about how the Council of Governments GIS team played a pivotal role in what we were doing. And so what you see here is that you have these different levels, these different individuals across the 3 states that we represent playing a role here. We have mid-level managers that are part of our committee. At our centers, they stepped up. They're participating in other committees outside of the 911 committee. So it's making sure that 911 has a seat at the table across these committees. Usually, most of them are under COG. So you have like the police chiefs committee, the emergency management, fire, even our CAs. And so what you see there when you have this collaboration and this energy, they're educated in 911. So for instance, because we have a seat at the table with our fire chiefs and our police chiefs, and I regularly educate my deputy mayor and my city administrator, when it's time for us to do something, when it's time for me to talk about next gen 911 or procure something, or upgrade some type of equipment, they already know what I'm talking about because the discussion is being had at different levels. And so that really has helped me as a leader of 911 to be able to get things done because those that support our center are familiar. But, you know, before I go on and pass it on to Steve, I just want to say that it's really important to have these relationships. We have a common goal, which is our community. We make sure we educate all of our needs. The approach is very cohesive. Tony and Dave and I talk a lot. And we follow through on the details to make sure that everyone understands what's needed in the 911 center in their jurisdiction, the 911 center in the state, and in this case, the 911 centers across the region. And so you definitely need advocates at all levels to create that cohesiveness. Next slide, and I will hand it off to Steve McMurray to take it from here.
Thanks, Karima. So as Karima has indicated, it's a very big task to work together to create that synergy and to keep that energy going. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that, but it repeats some of the points that Karima has made. The main point in terms of what we feel has been our success is that we have really tried to communicate and to do coordination that's meaningful, and wherever we can to involve people so that we're not making decisions in a vacuum. So collaboration. So communicating, coordinating, collaborating. Those are basic blocking and tackle things that you would expect out of any effort like this, but we just have to re-emphasize them that they're very, very important. It's the only way that you'll get informed decision making. You can get decisions made if you don't do some of those things, but your decisions may not be as well informed. And then when you get around to implementation, you may have some issues with that. Karima mentioned the structure of our committee. It is an overall level of directors from up to 20 plus some odd 911 agencies in the region. That includes the state of Virginia, the northern part of Virginia, the District of Columbia, and parts of Maryland. And we're subdivided into various groups. We do have a Next Gen 911 subcommittee that's focused on certain aspects of most of the technical aspects of moving this process forward. But as Karima mentioned, there's other groups that have been a part of this. We have people in the region within the committee who focus as being the liaisons and attending the coordinating meetings with the police chiefs and the fire chiefs. We have a CAD to CAD effort within the region that requires the 911 directors to stay plugged in so that they're aware of what's going on there. She mentioned that we actively have involved the carriers at different times. We have a subcommittee focused on that. And we do, there is a subcommittee that focuses on analyzing data from wireless calls and the way they're plotted in the area. As Karima mentioned, there are a lot of call transfers. Calls, as within any region, don't necessarily land where they initially need to. And Karima's people in particular have done a lot of work to try to gather data to improve that. So we have a lot of different subcommittees, and because it's not that we have a significant number of people necessarily to really round those committees out, but we do encourage and have had to understand that it requires people involved in this effort to shoulder some additional responsibility in terms of their day-to-day communication. So in terms of moving this forward, we tried to start back some 5 years ago with smaller efforts to get the ball rolling when things were a little less defined in terms of how to get to Next Gen 911. And we found that as we moved some of those smaller efforts forward, I'll speak about them a bit in just a minute, that helped energize and allowed us to then go back to people at different levels, the executive level, the working level, at the state level. There are different 911 boards that operate within Virginia and Maryland. It helped us communicate, here's where we're going, here's some initial feedback that we're getting in terms of what the direction should be, and it helped sort of move people in one direction. At a very early level, it helped us sketch out some interagency agreements that would allow us to move forward. And as you can see from the chart, there's quite a number of jurisdictions involved, and not every one of those jurisdictions can send people to some of these meetings. So it really emphasizes that even though you might have a representative, your main way of communicating them is to be diligent in your email communications, in your minutes, whatever it is that you can do to keep people involved. And that's what's going to be instrumental in making you successful. Next slide, please. So when we looked at moving forward for this effort to move to Next Gen 911, when we started in 2015, the availability of solutions in the market wasn't quite as mature as it is today. But we early on said our approach is going to be standards-based. We're going to try to make sure that we're interoperable as much as possible, and where there is a standard, we're going to request and demand in terms of requirements that our vendors commit to that, so that when we are evaluating systems in terms of proposals that we would solicit, that we would focus on things that meet those commitments and get a commitment from those vendors that they would do that. Of course, the main standard for Next Gen 911 is going to be in the area of the technical standards is the NENA I3 standard. So we really focused in on that. But in terms of any operational standards and guidance that we get from other associations, NENA or APCA, whoever it was, our goal is to try to encourage and use those standards so that we do foster interoperability at all levels. Now, when we do move forward with this, the way that one jurisdiction might implement the same technical solution in their environment sometimes leads to procedures that work well for them because of the nature of their customers in that area and their laws and regulations. So even though we may have a common technical solution, the policies sometimes vary a little bit in terms of how they're using it. So we have, whenever we've moved forward with some of these efforts, we're encouraging feedback and the application of lessons learned so that we don't have to, as Karima said earlier, recreate the wheel, and as Lori indicated. So those are things that sometimes you can find a common policy that's going to work. Sometimes things will vary a little bit, but you need to stress that as you move forward. Keep in mind what's working well for you, what sort of policies you're doing, what sort of procedures have you already written up so that the next jurisdiction or jurisdiction that's not necessarily directly adjacent to you does not have to recreate the wheel. And to the extent you can, the formal agreements, they take a long time to develop when you speak of legal requirements and signatures. Some of those agreements that we are looking at implementing now, we're able to do with a little bit more certainty because now we actually have some aspect of the technical systems in place. And so we will be able to be more specific about those. But they're slow. When you have to get signatures of 20 plus jurisdictions on agreements, it is difficult to do, but it's worth it. And you just need to make sure that you're committed to doing that. Next slide, please. So in our case, what we found worked well is that when you have a large effort like this, it helps if there is a lead agency to take the procurement lead. And that can be for different reasons, either the size of that particular procurement agency and or other factors. But it doesn't necessarily mean that you're just implementing your requirements for that agency. It's just easier if you can work as a team, have one lead procurement agency, and then you work your requirements as a collective so that you cover all the requirements for all the agencies, but you get the main technical and other operational requirements that the collective group of agencies require. And you fold that into a document that's led in terms of the procurement process through one lead agency. What we found is, in our case, one jurisdiction led that effort, but when we go through that procurement process, we did have representation in terms of doing the evaluation of multiple jurisdictions, because if one lead agency is the one that's doing the actual scoring of the proposals, that's obviously not going to work. So we had a cross multi-state and the District of Columbia effort in terms of evaluating the Next Gen 911 RFP that we eventually did get out on the street. And every jurisdiction committed to having people to read through those proposals, which is not an easy thing to do. They're fairly detailed, and then to score them and then to bring that forward. And as we went forward and we had those requirements, what we found once we were actually able to make an award, most of the jurisdictions can use the basic contract that is put in place. But in a few cases, there are some local requirements that have to be added to the contract. So what we found is that in some cases, the jurisdictions took the main contract and they had to supplement it for whatever the particular intricacies are with regard to labor agreements and other requirements of their particular jurisdiction. But the main thing is collaborate on requirements that meet the need across the jurisdictions, be sensitive to individual requirements, and once their contract is awarded, make sure that when you set that contract up that it's not so constrained that another jurisdiction can't take it and use it to, add on some things that are required for their particular case. Next slide. So I'm going to go through a couple slides here just to give you, and not in great detail, our timeline. We started back in early the spring of 2015 when we were just really becoming more familiar with how are we going to do this next gen 911 thing. It was common knowledge that it was required. There were plenty of cases where people and jurisdictions were talking about it. So what we decided to do is to do an initial request for information. So we gathered some high-level requirements. We went through a process to select, to send that out to some vendors. We got some early presentations in terms of the solutions that were available at that time, some order of magnitude approaches in terms of cost, and also an early look at what are some of the main successful things that needed to be done from the vendor's standpoint if we were to be successful in terms of actually making an award. And so with that, it was very clear, and by attending other conferences, it was very clear that getting your GIS data in order was a key thing. And so we began that effort in the fall of 2015, and then continued it in a more detailed fashion beginning early in February 2016. What I'll say that I think is leading to success in our area is we started that GIS effort early. And we have a robust GIS committee within the COG itself, the equivalent of the 911 Directors Committee. And the Next Gen 911 committee worked to get some funding that would allow those group of experts to actually do the detailed work to get our GIS data ready. So we started that in February 2016, and it went on for a couple years. Next slide, please. So in parallel, while that GIS effort is going, and we had regular monthly meetings, quarterly meetings, presentations, executive presentations on the whole GIS stream, working through what was needed, we began the efforts to pull together the requirements for the core systems of Next Gen 911, the Next Gen core systems elements, the functional elements that established the network. And so that began in February. We released our RFP in early August. At that time, back in 2016, we looked to borrow from other jurisdictions that we saw in the public sets of requirements that had been established, and did the best we could to establish a complete set of requirements. Since that time, as many of you may be aware, there are more NENA publications, and there are some things in APCO to help you establish what you should ask for in your requirements. So we were starting from cobbling together things that have been done in other jurisdictions. For those that are getting this process started now, there's some additional documentation that is more supportive that can help you move quicker. But we went through a process to solicit those proposals and to begin to analyze them starting in March of 2017. As we were moving into 2017, we also began to work on some of those regional MOUs. As we began to talk about doing this procurement, executives at various jurisdictions at state levels wanted to make sure that all jurisdictions were being signed and supportive of this effort. So we went through some process to put in some high-level memorandums of understanding. Next slide. When we got into August of that year, by the time we went through the process of all the things that were required from procurement, we made an award. From that point until we actually went live, there's about a little bit less than 3-year period. And during that period, what we found is that some of the solutions, particularly at some of the call handling systems, they weren't quite mature enough to be implemented. And so there was a process of trying to move forward, and then the various efforts with some of the vendors to implement, not in our jurisdiction, but in other jurisdictions, to get those ready for prime time took a while. So it wasn't until we got into this spring that we actually went live in Fairfax County, but now having achieved that and the solutions from the vendors being more mature and more capable of being plugged in with interoperability, we're finding that we're able to bring more jurisdictions on. So a couple other one jurisdiction just went live recently, Loudoun County. There's another county scheduled not too much later in September. By the end of the year, most of the jurisdictions, and then early into next quarter two of next year, we'll have just about every jurisdiction that has been signed up to this available. And that schedule is something that you should just be aware. You come up with a schedule. We'd originally anticipated that we would be done sooner, but every jurisdiction also has other things that are happening at different times in their region, and they have to take another effort with a related system that impacts their original ability to commit to the next Gen 911 rollout. Plan for that. That's just a reality as you move forward, that you can't be hard and fast in terms of what your hope is. You have to be flexible. You have to keep coordinating, and sometimes you have to switch positions based on where things are. Next slide. Lessons learned. The message here begins to become repetitive. Collaborating, communicating, coordinating. If you looked at this diagram, you see there lessons learned. It looks like a wheel that has all sorts of different stakeholders involved. And we don't have the time really to go into every detail of that, but there are so many touch points that you, as a driving force of moving Next Gen 911 into the area, need to do. You really have to rely, as we did, on our committee. Our goal was to identify as a working committee, these are the things that need to be done, and we had to push some of those messages out to our individual members and say, please communicate this back into your jurisdiction at all the levels that are necessary. So this wheel, as Karima pointed to, there's a lot of work. I look at this wheel as getting to Next Gen 911. To me, it's like a tractor wheel because we were really plowing a lot of ground to get this going. And your success is going to be dependent on trying to keep each of those stakeholders fully engaged, fully capable of helping the process roll forward instead of having a flat tire in one of those areas of coordination. And the more that you're able to keep your stakeholders engaged, aware, knowing that sometimes there are going to be issues, the better off you're going to be. And the strengthening of that ability to have progress really comes from lessons learned. It's almost like the axle in that diagram there. The lessons learned comes from communicating back to people what has worked well for you. We have frequent meetings at the 911 committee level. Some jurisdictions do lower level regional meetings, and it's a constant process. At some level, people get a little tired of speaking about it in terms of where we are, but it really is instrumental to being successful. And in addition to these high-level lessons learned about communicating and trying to measure performance and putting requirements in your RFP that are measurable, we put requirements in. And not only did we put requirements in, we went through when we did this implementation and did an assessment, a validation of whether the solution that's been implemented actually met those things. That can be a challenge sometimes. Some aspects of what you implement is proprietary, and you do the best you can to make sure that it's conformant, but you can gather data that indicates that, yes, we have implemented something that is NENA I3 compatible. You really just have to stay committed to that, and if you stay committed to that, the people, the partners, the vendors that you work with know that you're committed to that, to deliver things that are standard. And as we, as an example, have gone through this, we have developed documents that we put together for the benefit of other jurisdictions that are more detailed in terms of lessons learned. You know, how do you set up for testing? How do you make sure that you've reviewed your operational testing plan so it has all the elements that are in there? How do you make sure that you've loaded your GIS data, that you've made sure that everything is ready for you to go forward? So we have learned that we need to document those things because sometimes within 3 or 4 weeks, you forget the details. And that can really help the next jurisdiction that's coming along to do that. So when you look at the lessons learned, strengthen the axle of what you're doing as you move forward. Involve your stakeholders. It's a bumpy ride, but if you keep people involved, it can be less bumpy. At that, I think I'll turn it over to Karima.
Thank you, Steve. So I'll just wrap up by saying, what are we doing now? And so we're just not only revisiting our goals, we're creating new goals. The latest development, we talked about having subcommittees that will cover ops for the implementation of our ESInet and our next gen 911 services, operations, IT, and governance. Because if you really think about it, when you're talking about things, say call overflow, for instance, that's operational, but it's also technology needs there, and then also governance, right? We have 4 large PSAPs in the area, but we also have smaller PSAPs, and so how does that look? How do you carry over calls? I may can take certain calls from, say, Montgomery County, but could I take them all here in DC without overwhelming my system? And so we're gonna start having those discussions. As Steve talked about the lessons learned, we definitely refer to that. I would say 2 of the big things that came out of that was definitely timing. We can't pass up that each jurisdiction has its own priorities and its own resources, right? So there is a staggered approach. Steve mentioned that we have Fairfax County and Loudoun County that has gone live. Woohoo, we're happy for that. Here in DC, we're in phase 4 of 5. And so different jurisdictions, we are in a staggered approach. And then there's always political and governing hindrances, right? You have different setups and governments, and each one of us have our own resources. They look different. And so we just want to make sure that the ultimate goal, the final goal for everyone, is just to protect lives for our callers, our residents, and our responders. But the 2 pluses that I don't want anyone to miss is, I think that the procurement piece was huge, having one jurisdiction and carry that, and we, every jurisdiction in the region being able to ride that vehicle, and we all had input to that. As Steve talked about, we were all at the table with the evaluation, the requirements, and even selecting a vendor. And then lastly, we just aligned our goals. We made sure that we were working as a cohesive unit internally, and we were acting as a cohesive unit externally to city leadership or other disciplines chiefs. We made sure that we had our message together as 911, and when we went out to the field, we made sure that that message stayed the same. Next slide. So this is the last slide. I don't know if we still have time for questions, but this is it said any better than our chair, Tony Rose, in his commander voice? And this is just really what we work towards. This is the message that we keep in our back pocket as we continue to move forward here in the region. So I think I'll turn it over to Lori.
Actually, this is Sherry. Thank you, both Karima and Steve. We appreciate the information that you've shared with us. I know we are running a bit behind schedule, but we have had 2 questions come in. And so I would like to see if we can really quickly answer these questions. The first one is, where can we see the standards to be sure the solutions we create can be easily interoperable?
This is Steve. If you're looking from the technical standards, the best place that you're going to get that is to go to the NENA website. So the main driving standard, there's a version of it that is under development of the NENA I3 standard. is where you're going to find that. So the NENA.org is going to have all the standards for NextGen 911. There are some standards that are still being developed. So there's not yet a full standard for the call handling part of NextGen 911. That's in development. But there are standards that indicate the interfaces in terms of how the data is going to be passed from a call handling system into a NextGen 911 core system. So the NENA.org standards page, from my perspective, is going to be the most applicable one. And there are other operational guidance standards, information documents that are out on that same web page and within APCO that will provide you other guidance, because not everything can be written down to the last detail. So in some cases, you're going to have to take some guidance from the information documents that are available and use that to craft your requirements.
Okay, thank you. I also, Steve, added that on 911.gov, you can find a list of all standards. The next question is, what kind of agreement do you have with federal PSAPs, for example, military?
Steve, you could chime in. I do know that we, for our interoperability with our local PSAPs, we have an MOU, but we do not at this time have any any type of agreement with with the military PSAPs as far as ESInets or NextGen 911, but we do have communications with them that was already in place prior to this project.
Okay, so thank you again to both Karima and to Steve. And with that, Lori, I am going to turn it over to you and ask you to introduce our next set of speakers.
Thank you, Karima and Steve, and thanks, Sherry. We're going to move on to Chapter 4 because we got more to talk about here. This is an effort that has been going on for quite some time. The folks that are working on this and their predecessors have been working on the Interstate Playbook for years. And as a matter of fact, they have also included their vendors and contractors in the process, and they really deserve a lot of credit for doing that. If we move on to the next slide, you'll see the 4 people in the 4 states that have been consistently involved in this effort. They have finished chapters 1 and 2. And this is, it's chapter 4 of the Interstate Playbook, it's their 3rd chapter. And while all of their jurisdictions, their contractors, and their vendors have been involved in the process, the 2 people that will be speaking today are Blake DeRoshi, who is the NG911 Program Manager for Iowa, and Dana Wahlberg, who is the Director of Emergency Communications Networks in the Division of Public Safety for the state of Minnesota. So Dana and Blake, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Lori. As folks said, I'm Blake DeRoshi from Iowa. I'm the 911 Program Manager. And thanks everyone for continuing to come back and be interested in the Interstate Playbook. We have kind of been involved from the first 2 chapters and presented those at various settings, such as NASNA meetings, NENA conferences, and APCO conferences. So this is really kind of a continuation of those efforts. Previous chapters have kind of focused on state-to-state 911 call transfers. So you can see that is also included in Chapter 4, and Dana will have some kind of exciting developments on that effort a little bit later on. But you can kind of see some of the things that Chapter 4 includes. And certainly, if you want to know more about this, you can go ahead and read the entire document. We're not going to cover all of the items here on this webinar, but we'll touch some of the highlights. And one thing I wanted to point out, that this continues to kind of be a living and breathing effort. Some of the things that we're going to talk about, we're still working through and dealing with kind of on a regular basis. So it's not like it's behind us. It's still certainly evolving, and we're continuing to learn as we go as well. Next slide, please. One thing that we included starting here in Chapter 4 is kind of the Next-Gen 911 maturity model, kind of a way to give folks a quick reference or a cross-reference of where each of the states are within the Next-Gen 911 migration path. That way it gives you kind of a snapshot or an idea of things we're tackling and how it associates back to where we're at within the maturity level. So that is one thing that you'll be able to dig into within Chapter 4. Next slide. One of the things that is also addressed in Chapter 4 is the legacy network migration, and that was kind of a last-second substitution for a phrase that I think is maybe a little bit more familiar, and that's selective router decommissioning. For my NASNA peers, you might know or remember a month or two ago a survey that went out asking states to identify when they planned on decommissioning their selective routers. And just so you know where the 4 states stand, Iowa is 2030, Minnesota is unknown, North Dakota identified as 2027, and South Dakota 2030. And I'll speak for myself here in Iowa when that is an absolute guess, total stab in the dark on when that effort will be complete. There's a lot of things that go into decommissioning selective routers, and primarily, at least in Iowa, we don't own the selective routers. They are private infrastructure. We don't even have contractual relationships with the selective router owners. So a lot of things, like I said, go into that, and we're working towards those eventual legacy network migrations, but there's a lot of things that will have to fall into place to make that happen. So that is discussed within Chapter 4. If you can go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about our migration path. So I'll spend a lot of time on challenge number 1 a little bit later in the presentation, but to give you some ideas of where we're at, kind of specifically starting at challenge number 2. Historically in Iowa, the state entity, the state authority has always had control or authority over the wireless part of 911. Wireline 911 it was kind of done organically, and Iowa is a home rule state. But that being said, the state does have some authorities. 3 or 4 years ago, the legislature approached us and was really interested in, they phrased it as consolidation. But when you got right down to it, they were interested in saving money, which, of course, everyone is, and continuing to look and identify at better ways of doing 911 and saving money that way. So one thing that we came back to the legislature with as a way to save money is migrating the legacy landline network, which is still 3 selective routers, onto the Next-Gen 911 network, the ESInet, that we had in place for a number of years. The ESInet had been in place for wireless calls going back to around 2011. So we went out to bid and identified a network aggregator that would take that selective router traffic, put it onto the next generation 911 network through our next-gen core service providers data centers. So one of the challenges right away was the legacy provider, this legacy selective router, as well as the legacy alley database provider. Basically said once they are done providing the legacy camera trunks, they were no longer going to be providing alley services as well. So we kind of had to take a step back, go back to the drawing board, and figure out how we were going to make sure to continue to provide alley services in this statewide network. And that really caused about a year's worth of delay. The other one that I'll point out is just my position sits within the state emergency management department. So if you can imagine, we've been quite busy in the state emergency operations center this year, not just with COVID, but about a month ago, we had a derecho, which wind speeds were estimated around a Category 3 hurricane. And we're just really now starting to get back to normal and regular business operations. And one thing I'll point out there, and Lori kind of hit on it with our relationship with our vendors, they were able to continue to move the ball forward on some of these projects where myself and my coworker, we're a two-person shop, we were severely sidetracked and distracted with those 2020 type of events. So our vendors really did keep moving the ball forward, and certainly appreciate those efforts. And with that, I will turn it over to Dana to explain and talk through some of the Minnesota
Thank you, Blake. Well, I'm going to go through some similar challenges and some unique challenges. In Minnesota, before we can even get an RFP out on the street, it has to go through the Department of Administration. So there typically takes a lot of time in educating the procurement office to understand what we need in terms of network requirements and 911 processes for these types of initiatives. And that often takes a significant amount of time. We're educating them that we're not buying widgets off the shelf. These aren't commodities. These are highly complex and specifically tailored services for the state of Minnesota to provide mission critical public safety solutions for individuals when they need to call 911 for help. So that just takes some time right off the bat. So I don't think we want to underestimate the time any of these things take. Next slide, please, Sherry. The other thing that's very important to consider is legislative readiness. And the National 911 Program Office has actually developed a really good document as a guideline to help states navigate through that legislative transition process. And, I think the first thing is you need to really assess the readiness of your statute and never underestimate the power of legislative language and the impact that it can have on your migration. Establishing partnerships and relationships with your stakeholders and your originating service providers, carriers, whatever you call them in your state, that just is paramount. And it's certainly not as easy as striking E911 out of every statute and replacing it with NG911, because the technologies are very different. And it has very much been our experience in the state of Minnesota that not all of our originating service providers are really willing partners in sharing our enthusiasm about being an early next gen 911 adopter, and they're perfectly satisfied with the status quo legacy network and not really interested in migrating or rehoming their network away from the legacy selective routers. So really this legislative piece is the state authorities and legislative partners' opportunity to become gatekeepers and road pavers to keep your jurisdictional 911 systems current and moving forward. So I guess I can't stress that enough. And we have recently in Minnesota, or we're in the process, we have an open RFP right now to continue to use professional and technical consultants to assist us with revamping our statute going forward. And it is our hope to have something really clean and ready to bring forward, not in January of this year, but in January of 2022. Next slide, Sherry, please. So challenge number 3, I think, is the actual selective router migration process. And we have been going through this for a good 18 months. We are just about ready to finalize a contract and make a very long overdue award to a vendor to manage our ingress network rehoming. And I was hoping that we'd be able to make that announcement today, but unfortunately all the I's aren't dotted and the T's aren't crossed yet. So this aggregation and coordination is a very multifaceted initiative. And the more legacy networks and multiple service providers that you have in your state, or the more ladder regions that you have that you want to create connections in, the more complicated it becomes. So, and then keep in mind that, the original plan sometimes has to be abandoned or modified. So again, timelines should be flexible and be prepared to identify challenges, even if you're following a template that others have kind of forged on your behalf. You'll find challenges. And then, like Blake, we have also suffered from the pandemic, and then right on the heels of the pandemic, we jumped into all of that civil unrest and the riots and fires, and it's been a very, very difficult time, and I don't think any of us have been immune to the challenges of 2020. So I think challenge number 4 is going to be on everybody's list. So next slide, Sherry, please. The thing that we're very proud of in Chapter 4 is that we have been able to ensure that we have, because Iowa and Minnesota have disparate ESInet providers, we want to be able to transfer calls between our 2 ESInets. You may recall in Chapter 1, Minnesota and North Dakota accomplished that, and we provided a kind of a roadmap for that using a singular ESInet provider. So the next step was to try to do that with disparate providers. And, it's kind of a 3-step process, really, to bring it down to the lowest common denominator. And that is, intellectually, you need to establish a non-disclosure agreement. And that really helps establish and maintain confidentiality about the details of the work that's being completed using your vendor's proprietary solutions. You want to maintain their privacy with that. And this doesn't happen overnight. It took a good month or so for us to complete that piece. And then once you have that completed, you want to be able to exchange interface specifications. You want to be able to analyze and clarify one another's expectations, properly configure your labs so that they're ready again to be able to actually do some live testing. Again, this can take a fair amount of time depending on the complexity of the solution. And then finally, you have to agree and develop test cases. And really, you're building your test cases backwards from that goal that you want to establish. And in our case, we want to be able to successfully transfer calls with ALI for wireline, wireless, and VoIP calls across the Minnesota and Iowa borders, and we using 2 different service providers. So we worked to develop those test cases, and then eventually, determine what your expectations and outcomes are. And so that was all done. And I really, at this point, I'd like to pause just a second to acknowledge the assistance of both ComTech in the state of Iowa and Intrado in Minnesota for this effort. It took a tremendous amount of interaction, collaboration, and coordination between them, as well as between us as their partnering states to accomplish this. So hats off to them, and hopefully what's been accomplished in this initial testing is going to be beneficial to all of those who follow us going forward. Next slide. So the first thing is determining, getting your lab prepared. What are the interface specifications? What are the test cases? What's the schedule? How long is it going to take? And we started to plan that about 4 months before we actually wanted to be able to schedule lab time. And then the next thing that has to happen is you have to have a virtual private network between the 2 lab environments so that you can, simulate what you're going to be testing against real world environments. So that again took some time, and that is really something that the service providers did, and it was really seamless to us in the States. We were not part of that. That all happened behind the scenes. And then next is finalizing your testing details. You want to make sure that those that are performing the lab tests are involved in reviewing and establishing the test cases, understanding what the expectations are, setting up that simulated environment, exchanging TNs and PANIs so that you're simulating your environment just as though it were a live environment. And then finally, to actually do the testing. And, you know, we certainly had some challenges. We had some lessons learned. You can read about those in the playbook. But in our case, you know, a lot of this was happening right in the middle of COVID-19 stay-at-home orders. So, you know, we had to do a lot of adjusting of plans and schedules and so on to accommodate the testing. But, you know, what have we learned? What should have been done differently? We have those steps, and we are now ready to actually do some testing in a live environment. Minnesota and Iowa have executed an interstate cooperative agreement, the template of which will be shared as part of the playbook. And the next steps are really to order that connectivity between the two ESInets and to install and test in the live environment. So again, thanks to Intrado and Comtech for making this happen for us. And Blake, I'll toss it back to you.
All right, thank you. One of the things that I mentioned as a challenge earlier as I was speaking, I'll spend a little bit of time on now, and that's controlling migration costs. I'm fairly passionate about it right now. As I said earlier, it's kind of a, you know, dealing with a lot of this stuff still on a regular basis. It's certainly not behind us. And when we started our migration process, we wanted to be to fund the project in whole, to kind of get away from the PSAPs having to fund a lot of this themselves. As the state authority, we thought some of these projects were in our wheelhouse, and we needed to be the funder of them. And we were set up well to do that. We had a good funding model, and our surcharge was adequate and able to take on some additional costs. So we asked for all-inclusive pricing from our network aggregator, and we got what we thought was all-inclusive pricing. Come to find out, however, that there were a few things that the network aggregator was unaware of, and frankly, so were we. And there are telcos within the state that have special access tariffs that they file with our Iowa Utilities Board. The Utilities Board deregulated wireline service a couple of years ago, and no longer regulate originating service providers within the state. So to put it, I guess, rather bluntly, those telcos are basically able to name their price when it comes to special access tariffs. And those have historically been paid by the PSAPs. Also, they have historically charged PSAPs for alley costs. So if a person were to move or disconnect service, those alley costs, alley change records are passed along to the PSAP. And those costs were not identified throughout our procurement process. We had a number of meetings and workshops leading up to the eventual RFP and contract awarding, and number of meetings with telcos and PSAPs, and those costs never really came up. So we thought by asking for an all-inclusive pricing, we were getting an all-inclusive price, and come to find out we didn't. So we are now working back through the Utilities Board to see if they have any jurisdiction, any authority to help sort through this. We've put in some feelers with the FCC on this topic. So again, we're living and breathing this every day, and no resolution at this point. But it is causing a fairly significant hurdle at this point towards our next gen transition and migration. At this point, we have about 10 to 15 of our 113 PSAPs who have migrated. And you know, when we started this project, they were under the impression that all of these costs were going to be removed from their authority, and we would be paying them. And we're kind of coming to a point where we're at a standstill and butting heads, not just with the telcos, but with the PSAPs as well. So just another thing to put on your radar and make sure you're looking out for within your states and your authorities before you get too far down the road. If you go to the next slide, it'll look fairly familiar. It was also kind of presented in chapter 3, and really the only thing that I'd have to add onto this is just knowing who is who. You know, use your peers, drawing on the expertise from others is really how you can sum up this slide. In the midst of our migration, I reached out to Washington State. I knew they were kind of going through a similar transition, and a lot of the same players were involved. And that's really important too. I mean, every state is different, but at the same time, if you can drill down and really see what vendors and what players are involved, you might get an idea of how things are going to go within your jurisdiction. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword, however, because some of the drama that might occur one state can bleed over into your state or your jurisdiction as well. So it's good to know what you're getting into, but just also realize that some of those partners might have been working together elsewhere, and depending on how that went, you might get some of their bleed over experience as well. So with that, I believe I turn it back over to Dana to close this out.
All right, thanks everybody, and we appreciate you staying with us here as we're going over a few minutes, but I think I'd like to close, Sherry, if you'll flip to the last slide here, in just acknowledging the work of the National 911 Office and its consultant mission critical partners. Certainly, we could not, as 4 states, have done this successfully without their guidance and support. They've documented all of this. They've organized things behind the scenes, managed conference calls and whatnot for us. So this has been a luxury that we've had, that, and the fact that this has all been documented makes it an excellent launch pad for the rest of the states. So I would really encourage you to turn to the Interstate Playbook as you start to develop and roll out some of your initiatives. Take some of the lessons learned and the challenges, reproduce what you can. There's guidance, templates, you know, sample letters of agency that you can use, things that you don't have to create yourselves. Understanding that everybody is going to have a little bit of a unique situation and solution, yet there's still plenty of guidance and the ability to encourage collaboration and, you know, reproduce what you can from this without having to go back and starting from square one again. We've enjoyed doing it. We've had the luxury of having stellar support from the 911 office and from MCP. So take advantage of that. And again, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day. Sherry, I'll turn it back to you.
All right, thank you, both Deanna and Blake. That was a great bit of information that we are digesting very quickly. So with that, as Dana mentioned, I do know that we are running over a bit. However, the questions that we don't get to, we will send to our speakers via email and have them reply, and those responses will be provided back with the recording. With that, I'm going to ask Sheila. We did have a question come in. Sheila, you want to go ahead and...
Yes, thanks, Sherry. The question reads, for the VoIP testing with the VPCs like Contact and Intrado, were there any issues with E911 calls from the video relay centers and vehicle telematic call centers?
This is Dana, and to my knowledge, there were not, but I was not actively involved in the testing. I'm not sure if there's someone else on the call that was, and if not, I think that's something that we need to go back and do some further checking before we provide a definitive response.
This is Blake, and oh, go ahead. I was going to say nothing that I remember discussing or hearing about at the time of the testing, but I agree, we can definitely go back and double check that answer.
Exactly. Thanks, Blake. This is Sherry, and that's what I was going to say. I'm sure the information will be in the chapter, but in addition, we can go to the folks who were responsible for testing and provide an answer when we post all of this information to 911.gov. So with that, I want to thank you again to all 4 of our speakers today. You guys had some great information, and unfortunately, we did have a limited amount of time. This concludes today's webinar, and we appreciate everyone's participation. As a reminder, there will be an archived version of today's webinar available on 911.gov soon. And as we mentioned, we will post responses to the questions along with that recording. Our next and final webinar for 2020 is scheduled on Tuesday, November 10th. The link to register for that is here on the slide. And we hope that you're going to be able to join us for that. With that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.